So the database has not been loaded. And this is where Boundary comes in. Boundary will control human to machine access. As Chris mentioned before, it's an identity. It will be able to handle the identity access management. We, in this case, right, we want to be able to control access from a development team to the database, or we want to be able to control, let's say, the operations team to SSHing into certain, VMs, for example. So there's a lot of patterns that you can use here. And Boundary will be able to accomplish that. We have some Boundary experts on the call, so if I get anything wrong, I expect them to correct me. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask them specifically about Boundary. I'm Rosemary Wong, I'm a developer advocate for HashiCorp. So I recommend you take a look. Boundary is a newer product. So if there's any improvements or feedback that you have or any patterns that you'd like to see, we always appreciate the feedback. Okay. So remember our application. I mentioned, front end, public, products, right? So we're going to go back to this example again. Important thing is the product team needs to load data into the database, right? So my database, as I mentioned before, is PostgreSQL. It's private. There's really only one way to access it, which is hopefully through some kind of VM that's available to access it. So this would be perhaps a bastion or some kind of jump box, right? The other important thing is that also the product team needs access to the front end for testing. This is maybe a little bit of a unique case in that perhaps the product team is trying a new feature. They don't want to release it to production yet, but they need very select access to a development instance, and they want to be able to test it. So we're actually going to use Boundary to give the product team what they need, which is access to both of these things. And a side note is that the operations team, just as a fail-safe or any kind of break glass scenario, needs SSH access to what I would say the Kubernetes VMs. So I have VMs running Kubernetes. You might need to go in and do something to fix it, right? From a service standpoint, an operations team does need a break glass capability to go in and make sure that things are working, fix it if they need to. They also have database access, and this is to fix any database problems, right? So operations team does need that. So the Boundary configuration we have today, Boundary in this configuration is deployed into a public subnet. So everything was deployed into private subnets. In this case, it is deployed into public subnets. You can shift them into the private subnets. In this case, just for the demonstration, I have them in public. But the control flow is that the operations team engineer, for example, authenticates to Boundary and they get a token, right? And that allows them to then access a worker to SSH to any nodes, right? So they actually will use the worker to any TCP target, right? It doesn't, SSH really is just TCP on 22, but any TCP target within the boundary that the Boundary worker is aware of, right, will be able to access. They'll be able to access. So it goes through that flow. It's very similar to Vault, right? Notice it's a two-step process again. You authenticate and then you'll be able to access. The other important thing that is part of as the operations team, as I mentioned before, is that you should be able to access PostgreSQL on 5432. Again, TCP target, it's able to access that. So a product team has a similar workflow, right? A product team member needs to access PostgreSQL 5432, and they also need to access the front end on TCP/IP. So there's different kinds of targets and different kinds of ports, and we need to configure Boundary in order to allow for these operations and product team members to be able to do what they need to so that they can actually work on the applications and the database that they need.
Just one question regarding the audit log. Is it the same format like Vault in Boundary, that we can track who tried to access Boundary from outside?
I'm Jeff Mitchell. I'm the engineering lead on Boundary. So we don't have an audit log yet. We have a server log, but it will be using the same HCLog library that we use. So you will be able to get access to it either in a text format or a JSON format. And as we make enhancements to support auditing within Boundary, then it's because we're using a shared library with Vault, then any enhancements we make in terms of where we can ship logs, how we ship logs, et cetera, will go between the products as well.
And last but not least, because this is exposed externally here, yeah? What do you have to detect if somebody tries to gain access to Boundary, yeah? So I'm just making an example, tries several different username, password combination, things like that.
So when we have an audit log, that would be a good use of that audit log to log those things into like a seam, so that you can run analysis on that and look for those kinds of patterns. It's a very, very early product. We simply don't have that yet, but it's on a roadmap.
So you do you have something like if from the same source we have more than number of requests, please block it or something like that?
We don't currently know, but that kind of thing is on a roadmap. Yes.
Okay.
It is an extremely new product.
Okay.
Yeah.
Understood.
Yeah, it is new. And so some of these, if you have feedback or you have ideas, definitely let us know.
When did it launch? When did it go live?
October last year, right, Jeff?
October. Okay.
That's correct.
Yeah. So it is newer. It is open source.
It is open source, and so the kinds of things that you're talking about are certainly a part of that enterprise readiness story, right? So when we launched, it was really getting the initial patterns and product out there and the workflows, and now we're working really hard on adding those features that are needed both by open source and enterprises. So things like OIDC is coming out very soon for authentication. Audit logging and that kind of threat detection is on the roadmap as well. So we're adding features, but it did come out in October, so it's a very new product. It's going to take a little bit to mature, but we're on that path.
Speaking of the right path, we actually, to get this on the right path, right? So to get my application working again, but also to make sure that my teams from a human access standpoint are able to do what they need to do, but not have more access. From a least privilege standpoint, I actually can group, in Boundary, I can group the different teams, right? And I can also control what targets that they have. So the way that the boundary domain model works is that there's an organization, and you can have multiple organizations, but there's also groups that you can specify within the organization. The groups themselves group users. So in this case, I have Melissa, who's on the leadership team. I have myself on the operations team, and I have my fantastic colleague, Rob, on the products team today. And so you can group any of the users, in terms of the access as well as the scope. So there's actually certain scopes that you can grant to said groups of users. For example, I have 2 projects available. I have a core infra project. So this is all my core infrastructure. This is specifically the EKS nodes that I have in place, right? So I don't want everyone to access my Kubernetes VMs, right? I don't want everybody to access the VMs that really shouldn't be accessed directly by anybody else, right? I just only need it for maybe a break glass scenario. So in that case, I put that in core infrastructure. There's also the project, which is of products infrastructure. So this would be the products database. This could be the front end target as well. I actually managed to get a bonus thrown in here too. So you'll see that later. But here we're grouping the infrastructure, right, based on the project. So in this case, what I'll actually be able to do is tell Boundary, hey, I want you to create these targets in these projects. These targets can be accessed by certain groups, et cetera. In this case, operations can access the products infra project and the core infra project for any maintenance or operations scenarios on these targets. So I can access TCP22 and TCP5432. For the case of Rob, who's on the products team, Rob can access the database and the front end. In this case, Rob can only access products infra. They can't, Rob cannot access core infrastructure, right? So no one will be able to SSH into the EKS nodes or the VMs unless they're in the operations group. And as a side note, the leadership team is read-only. So some of these controls you can change, you can update, you can grant more or less depending on similarly like API endpoints. So it's depending on the kind of domain model, the domain concept that you're trying to access. Okay, so we're going back to this because this is the whole thing together, but the idea is that by the end of this, we will hopefully have Vault, Console, and Boundary all working together to demonstrate this is basically a system that someone can actually administer to, but we've also controlled machine identity and machine authorization and authentication as well. So let's go back and let's actually fix this database. The first thing that I'm actually going to do is show you Boundary. So Boundary has this is a UI for Boundary right now. You can choose a scope, as in this case, I called it organization just because it's the default configuration that I set up. And in this case, I'll log in as Rob, right? Remember, Rob is on the products team, and Rob can only access the database and the front end target. So I'm going to actually log in as Rob and show you what happens. Unfortunately, in order to log in as Rob, I need a password. Right now, I'm using password authentication for Boundary. As Jeff mentioned before, there are other integrations in terms of authentication that you can add going forward. But since as newer product, this is currently using username and password. So keep that in mind. What you have here is actually just me doing a password, username, password authentication. I just have to get the password. I've clearly secured it, but I don't want to show it on screen. Oh no, what happened now? Oh, products password. Yeah, so I don't want to show it on screen, which is why it's PB copy. So you'll have to take my word for the fact that I'm not showing you my password.
It's okay. Not HashiCorp 123, is it? I'm just asking for security friends.
I recommend you try the various combinations. It's I can't guarantee it's not HashiCorp 123, but yeah, I will say all of these passwords have been randomly generated, and at the conclusion of this session, this will all be destroyed. So they will be rotated accordingly. So Rob here, has maybe some like read-only access, right? I've just provided Rob some read-only access, but he can't see anything in my core infrastructure. I don't have targets for him to access. There's nothing there for him to see. However, if I go to products, I can actually tell that there are some things that I could do within products. So in this case, I have my products database Postgres. Notice that I did not create a front-end endpoint yet. The front-end endpoint doesn't exist yet. But right now I can only access the products database Postgres, and this will allow me to configure, at the very least, finally, my products data, which has been sort of why my application's not been working. So what I'm actually going to do is log in as Rob and configure the data. So because it is quite a lengthy command, mostly because I do not want to print out the passwords, you're going to have to look at the giant printout. But first, I'm actually going to configure the database, and this database configuration just loads the passwords in. So you're actually going to see the password. That's okay, as I mentioned before, but I wanted to make sure that you at least got a sense of the workflow. The idea is that you authenticate with the password, right? In this case, I've authenticated as Rob, and I use the password authentication method. I get back some, sort of some settings here, and I get a token. It expires. And the next thing I can do is then connect to Postgres. So remember, I can connect to any TCP endpoint. In this case, I've already configured the TCP endpoint in Boundary to go to my Postgres database. I have a username Postgres. There is a password that I have obfuscated. You will not be able to see the password to this database. But I can actually connect to this database using my Postgres username. I target the TCP target. So here, this target ID matches the target ID in my target list. So this is where TCP CBN comes in. All right. And what I've done is actually I've passed other arguments. For example, I want to go into the products database, and then I want to load the data in there. So all of the data for coffee, et cetera. As a note, these are arguments that you will have to pass to Postgres, right? So that's a way that you can sort of extend and control what you're accessing. You still need to control some kind of policy on the database side to make sure, right, you're doing this. You're controlling who's accessing the database, but also how far someone can get within that database itself.
One thing I want to highlight about that Boundary Connect Postgres. So we have Boundary Connect as the main command, and it simply instantiates a session, and it opens a listening socket, and you can use that session with whatever you want. We have a number of kind of helper subcommands. Postgres is one of them, which is, it's basically syntactic sugar. It's there to make your life easier. So there's one for SSH, which will do things like set the key name that it's looking for so that you don't get a lot of prompts asking, do you want to connect to this address and this port. There's one for HTTP, which can set some things for you with HTTPS to make curl a bit nicer to use. But you can actually specify your own This is designed to make it easy to have these different styles that you can kind of build up. But you can actually use Boundary Connect, and you can pass in your own executable if you want. You can also just run Boundary Connect. Get a listening port. You can do whatever you want with it. But you can pass in your own executable and actually create your own command lines. And so I don't know where it is offhand, but I know one of the people on our team wrote something up at some point where they actually used Boundary Connect with the exec flag and arguments passed in to have it act as an SSH proxy command. So they could actually put that in their SSH config. And so whenever they want to SSH, they just call SSH, it calls a proxy command, which routes it through Boundary automatically. So it's actually a very flexible thing. But those subcommands like Postgres are not the only things that it's capable of doing. The target defines what is possible. So in this case, the target type is TCP, so it can handle any TCP connection, not simply the ones being shown here.
I actually got to play around with this. It was pretty exciting. I'll show the bonus extra that I figured out to this morning. So it's actually pretty interesting. So the fact that you can specify any TCP target makes it really, really powerful, right? I'm using Postgres as an example. I'll show the SSH example just to demonstrate the fact that it is restricting, for example, Rob from not SSHing, and I can SSH. So let's say I want to make SSH operation, SSH products. So this is Rob SSHing into the worker nodes, right? So again, from a product standpoint, right, does not necessarily need access to the SSH target, right? Shouldn't be able to do that, permission denied, which is pretty neat. If I do operations, which is Rosemary, let's do that. All right, so that's me. I should be able to SSH into these VMs for either break glass or some other maintenance, et cetera, for other investigation, troubleshooting. So this is pretty much what Jeff was talking about before. This just kind of makes it easier to say it is SSH, and I can SSH and pass these argument flags in there, including the private key. But I will just print out the Docker containers just to show that there's stuff running on this machine, and it is actually Kubernetes. So you see a ton of stuff here. Okay, so that is specifically SSH commands. Those are, how, let's say Rob accessed the database. Now let's see whether or not this application worked. And let's hope it did. So I'm going to actually go back here. And what I'll actually do is register the front end as a target in Boundary. Remember before, right, Rob needs a way to test whether or not the front end application is working. And so before I do any of this, let's actually check, let's debug ACTL. So port forward product. Now as someone who's a development team member, maybe I use Kubernetes, maybe I don't. It kind of just depends. You also have access control that you have to consider as well on many of these products. And it's still unable to list products. Okay, you know what we'll do? When in doubt, redeploy. So I'm going to deploy that. Sorry. And in terms of the other thing that I wanted to show, I'll actually move on to that part. The other thing I wanted to show is actually there is a Boundary desktop client. It is new. It is new. I will caveat that it is new, but it's actually pretty neat. I'm able to do something really interesting that I didn't think I would be able to do. So I have an organization, I'll authenticate as myself, right? So I showed that me as Rob has access to database and will eventually have we'll have access to front end, hopefully, for testing. But me as an operations person, maybe I have additional access. So what I'm going to do is get my password so that I can log in. Terraform output products. We'll change that to operations password. And what I'm going to do is log in and see what endpoints I have access to. As it turns out, I have access to a couple of different projects, right? The first being core infrastructure. I'm sorry, I will try to increase the size of this, but it won't increase. So I have access to core infrastructure. I also have access to products infrastructure. So this is the products database, right? No surprise there. I said during break glass scenarios, maybe these are things that I need access to. But I also have something interesting here. I have access to HCP console and HCP vault. So I previously mentioned that HCP console and HCP vault were public, right? And that's not okay for production, right? I did need to configure vault and console, so I did it over public, but actually I could deploy them privately. And what I actually did instead was I told Boundary, hey, I'm going to register the target to the private endpoint, right? So here is a private endpoint to HCP. So basically, if you have some kind of private endpoint and some peering connection available for any managed offerings, it doesn't matter if it's HashiCorp or not. If you have any managed offerings that allow this private peering connection, you can basically say, hey, Boundary, act as a jump box for me to access those TCP targets. So in this case, I could access the private console endpoint. And I can also access the vault endpoint as well. You can also tell that I accessed it before. So I can access them as I need to. So let's see if I can copy this. What this actually will do is it will locally create a listener locally. So let's actually connect. I'll connect listener to vault since that one's the popular one. Here it creates a listener locally on port 54971. And what I'll do is I'll go here and I will do 54971. It is over HTTPS, so there's some stuff there that needs to be done. But here is basically the same interface, right? So it's the same vault instance. I'm just accessing this over Boundary instead. So this is actually done over the private endpoint, which is really nice because then if you have any managed offerings that you want to protect from the outside world, you have CI systems that need to configure these, right? You can do it privately or set up a Boundary listener and actually do this privately, which is pretty neat. So I'm going to log into Vault just to show you that this is not just the local Vault that I've spun up. And it's the same database, right? The same connections available. And so if I needed to administer to anything within sort of a private network, I can use the Boundary to spin up a listener and be able to go in and access and change the things that I need to. And I can also terminate the sessions accordingly. So in this here, I can terminate this session and it will disconnect me. By the way, you could actually, I didn't have time to do this, but you can actually put Boundary. Kubernetes is a TCP target, so you could put Kubernetes, you could control your Kubernetes execs as well, so you don't have people just randomly going in and doing this. But this is an indication that the product is working, right? So it is actually working as intended. The other important thing that I will do is actually grab the endpoint. So for the front end, what I actually have for front end specifically is a special endpoint that I've created. It is an internal load balancer. You can do any number of things. I just chose to do an internal load balancer. And I'm going to update this target in Boundary. So with you can also check out my products front end just to make sure that I have this correctly. You could configure Boundary using CLI. In this case, I've opted to use Terraform. And there's a nice side effect to this, or not side effect, but there's a nice benefit to this in that if you do want to audit, your configurations, your infrastructure configurations further, you can use, you can audit your files, for example. So in this case, you could say that you products front end. I think this is products front end address. You could use, let's say, Sentinel to audit this and make sure that you're actually using this correctly. So I'm going to do this. This is what happens. Connect this up. From an operations standpoint, someone will have to actually register this, right? So you'll notice as an operations team member, I'm now responsible for going in and registering these targets. You could have a number of other folks who decide to register these targets. If you have an organization that people are in control of their own infrastructure, they can do what they want. They might register these targets for themselves. I know this is paint dry. Yeah, so I know in terms of a security, most of the secure product, folks are most familiar with Vault. It's a secrets manager. It's going to rotate and provide a lot of the provide a lot of the benefit for the dynamic secrets if you want to issue them across your organization. But in terms of holistically, right, a lot of this is focused on the developer flow. We didn't really go into the operations flow today, like how is someone going to secure all of these things? As I mentioned before, there are some improvements that you can make to this topology, right? You can move things into different environments. In the case of Console and Vault, if you're running it by yourself, open source, you probably want to put it in a separate AWS account. Effectively, that is actually what the HashiCorp Cloud Platform is doing in this case. It is putting it in a separate AWS account for isolation. And so this is from a shared services standpoint. If you do this in your organization, you might very well put any shared services in an isolated network in any kind of sort of account or project or isolated section. With Boundary, we have a couple of reference architectures available, so you can pick and choose how you would like to deploy it. It is newer though, so if there's any particular approach that you recommend, we're always open to hearing that as well. But from a development standpoint, right, this is still letting developers do what they want and do what they need, but they don't have to be subject to some of the deeper nuances of the internals from a security standpoint. So from even an operations standpoint, if you combine all of these together, or even if you use one or two of them, you're basically allowing sort of automation to sort of take away the additional overhead of either revoking rotating secrets or controlling service communication and trying to figure out identities between services. And then you also have sort of the identity access management piece, which Boundary will be able to help control as well. So there's a lot of components. And I know we went through a lot today and it's like 2 hours. So if it takes some time to absorb, I do want to make a note that the demo app is available if you want to check out the configurations yourself and you want to dig deeper into the architecture. There is the code available. And if you have any questions, you can always reach out to me as well.
I have a general question. So you have now this beautiful integration with Vault Boundary, yeah? Mm-hmm. From a roadmap, what is for me a bit missing, maybe I'm on the wrong track, but how is the auditing component? I want to know, are all my developers, everything confirmed? Do they use these tools? Is everything in Boundary? Do you have something on the roadmap, or how would you approach to verify that an environment is secured, is just using the Vault for all the keys, is just having the access limited via Boundary and things like that? Do you have something for that on the radar, or is it already there and it's just a matter of leveraging the audit logs?
Audit logs will obviously show you the things that are passing through Vault and eventually Boundary when it gets the audit log capability. And Boundary does it stores information about any sessions that pass through it already, which is it's put into a warehouse in the database with a format that can be pulled into Power BI and other similar types of tools very easily. So it's that warehouse model that you can then kind of run analysis on. So just to be clear, like session information is stored that way. It's more like the HTTP audit log that isn't actually there yet. And as we get more and more capabilities within Boundary, we're going to get more information about what's happening within those sessions. But one of the things, I think it's hard for us to say, how do we make sure that things are only going through Boundary or only going through Vault? Because really, you'd have to look on the actual various applications to find out, like, okay, something came to my application and and it didn't hit Vault first or it didn't hit Boundary first. Reconciling those logs with Boundary or Vault or Console, I think, is the challenge. However, there are some things you can do that are like defense in depth that can actually help a lot. So for instance, with Boundary, one of the things we encourage is, yes, you have to, you can have to gain access through Boundary to, to your services. And you can say, okay, these services are, they require authentication, but also, the way to get into them is through, like, you're on a private network, you have a Boundary worker, you get through there. But you can also layer on extra security. So for instance, you can say, I actually am going to also on that machine and on the listener set up a firewall such that only the Boundary workers are actually allowed to have incoming connections. And so, if I want to guarantee that things are going through Boundary, yes, I have the logs on Boundary. That doesn't necessarily show things that don't come through Boundary, right? Because Boundary won't know about
Exactly.
it. But you also have that extra defense in depth of setting up a firewall such that you have to actually go through, that the only source addresses that are allowed are coming from Boundary workers. So there are things that you can layer on that help. I think that what you've described is sort of an intractable problem generally, because you have to be able to say, for any given connection, how do I reconcile it across these various systems and make sure that like I see this thing in an autolog here, autolog there. One other thing I'll say about Boundary specifically, I can't speak to Vault or Console, is that we are going to add support for open telemetry, so that you can carry like trace IDs through, and so then you could try to perform that kind of analysis if you have logs from your applications as well as Boundary as well as anything else that's in the middle, going up to some kind of seam. You could track and see like, do I have any trace IDs that I see in my application that I don't see a matching one from Boundary? So there are also other things that we're going to add to try to make that more kind of tractable and traceable. But I think that a large part of the answer is going to have to be layering on defense in depth, because that's
yeah, so I'm coming here from an audit standpoint. It's all super secure if you enforce Boundary, if you enforce everything over the vault, yeah. But then you have the problem, sometimes just a lazy admin problem, that people bypass these wonderful things, yeah, to make their lives a bit easier and things like that. So that would be, I understand it's not in your focus at the moment, but this is kind of what I always need to verify as from an auditor standpoint, that all the tools are really enforced, that they are working, and this is the only method how something can be accessed. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'll add that I think for deeper conversations, I think if you wanted to talk to our product manager, he would very much love to get all of that information ingressed and figure out how we can better best address that as we go forward.
And just a side note from a console standpoint, it's still, this problem still exists if you have a service mesh, right? How do you make sure that services within the mesh are actually, someone's not just deploying a database and then somehow magically connecting to it, right, without the proxy in place. And I just wanted to confirm this. There's a potential roadmap item to help alleviate this, but you still do need defense in depth. Blake, who's our console expert, are you able to explain this a little further?
Yeah, so first, hi, I'm Blake, product manager on console. So something that we're looking at in the next release of console is to introduce support for transparent proxying. That basically, in a nutshell, configuring the service mesh in such a way that all of your outbound TCP traffic is directed through the proxy. And then what we would provide on top of that is, by default, you'd have the ability to access any external destination outside of if it exists outside of your service mesh, but you'd also have a way to lock that down to say that only connections to destinations in the mesh should be allowed. So you have a little tighter control of what's egressing your environment. And then beyond that, we're also looking at enhancing the terminating gateways that Rosemary spoke about earlier. At the moment, those provide egress connectivity to other destinations that are within your data center, outside your service mesh, but still within your four walls. We're looking at enhancing those to make them build a route more generic traffic to like destinations on the internet. So you can say, I only want to expose endpoints like Twilio or Stripe or whatever I might be using in my environment. And these endpoints should only be exposed to these users, maybe using these HTTP paths. You'd be able to get very granular on defining those access policies.
Yeah, I actually had that also in mind when I asked the question. Makes sense for you to develop something where you have an independent policy layer where you can stop connections.
Just as a wrap up, the app is working. You can buy a Packer Spice Latte. Again, you won't be able to submit your payment information. This is not PCI compliant or at least in this case, that part is not implemented yet. But the idea is to balance this developer velocity, hopefully drive it, right? And still provide the security. It's not perfect, but at the very least, the hope is that you're able to implement more secure practices while also allowing developers to still be able to do what they need to do and audit and observe everything that's happening. And so just as a general conclusion, again, all of this configuration, you're welcome to check out yourself. If you're curious about one piece or another, that's in the demo repository I've listed here. I've also posted the slides as well to the field day team. And today, you got at least a short overview of Vault, Console, and Boundary. Hopefully, if there's any other questions you have on any of the other tools, we look forward to hearing from you.
It's been a very impressive demonstration and a lot of stuff that I and probably a couple of other delegates hadn't really thought of in terms of HashiCorp before. I'm curious who you guys see your competition or the companies out there that challenge you in the spaces you're working in. Does that question make sense? Feel free to punt it off to somebody else if you like.
Yes, it does make complete sense. And I might defer to some of the experts to at least talk about some of the alternatives in the respective products. It depends heavily per product as well. I don't know how many of the Vault team we have on here, but any of the managed secrets services, right, in most of the cloud providers, that implement some form of functionality similar to Vault. And so, most competitors are implementing some form of secrets management. Vault team, anything I'm missing in that front?
I think ultimately, and this is kind of a view from HashiCorp across our products, is we want to enable developers in different workflows so that ultimately we don't really kind of position anything as a one or the other. We tend to be more open to incorporating different workflows. Like for Vault, for example, our goal is to bring in as much of the kind of disparate solutions out there that could integrate with Vault. So whether it's you're storing secrets in these different things, but using Vault as the mechanism to do that, using different ways to authenticate in, connectivity-wise with different environments through console or even Boundary, working with the different service catalogs and these different things that are potentially even using the same kind of pieces. Ultimately, we try to view ourselves as more of a Switzerland, where we want to work with the different technologies within these different companies versus dictating that they have to use ours in a kind of prescriptive way. And ultimately, what this allows us to do is, I think, work more closely with, whether it's companies or on a kind of more granular level with the developers on what is the best way that the tool can solve their problem. So ultimately, that's kind of our, I guess, view of the landscape, if you will.
So a good way to generically describe what HashiCorp does is developer-focused security, right?
It's definitely one of them. It's more that we're trying to help developers and companies kind of bridge that gap into, we want to help partner them into cloud, and it's more about infrastructure automation. Security is a huge tenet of that. If we're just kind of being honest about it, but there's also several different pieces where how we also are aimed at streamlining the way that people develop and deploy applications, provision and secure infrastructure. So it really kind of takes on these different things. We often look at it as kind of 4 different planes, which is provisioning, security, connectivity, and then the application or runtime layer. Ultimately, there's a security piece in most of those, if not all of them. So we kind of sometimes joke that we are a security company that does these other things, just because there's a secure aspect to all of them. But generally speaking, we try to look at ourselves more as a company that helps enable developers and companies to kind of bridge that gap between existing environments in this kind of modern cloud automation world.
When it comes to customers, are you guys seeing more action in one industry or one vertical than another, or are you guys pretty neutral?
Yeah, good question. I would say we're starting to see more kind of broad adoption at this point. I think early on with some of our products, we definitely had more vertical specific. So on the security side, it would be more maybe around industries that have highly sensitive data, or kind of industries that require certain compliance and governance. we're seeing a broader adoption now among, whether it's the global 2000 or enterprise customers and even small and medium businesses. We don't really kind of, I guess from the workloads, we try to bring in or account for all of them, if that makes sense. And then obviously on like the enterprise and how we approach commercial agreements, that's where we kind of focus more on a specified list.
So how does Consul handle certificate management, like on the proxies and the gateways?
Consul is responsible at its core for automating that the issuance and rotation of certificates for gateways, proxies. There's a couple different ways that you can use those certificates in Consul. So Consul ships out of the box with a built-in CA that it can bootstrap as part of the service mesh. And that's probably usable in smaller demo environments or non-prod environments. In production, customers typically will utilize the integration with Vault. So Consul supports integration with Vault and AWS PCA as well as external CA. So you can leverage either of those. You can also bring your own certificates if you have an existing CA in the environment and you want Consul to derive the service mesh certs from there. You can also bring your own. So there's multiple ways, but essentially once Consul has that integration with the external source, then it will use that as an intermediary to issue certs to the sidecars, manage the rotation of those, the expiration, all of that.